Hello and welcome to another Top Grades Made Easy video, and it really will be easy in this video because this poem is a gift. It's one which you can relate to any theme and it's super easy to understand. I'll be analysing it using the FOSS method that forces you to get top grades. Let's jump into the poem and see how that works. The first thing we can say about the form of the poem is that it appears to be a love poem. It begins with a sunny day and it ends with the final line focusing on what love is. In this case, it's the love of a father for his son, and the son is probably around 23 or 24 years old, and the poem is written to that son. It's worth speculating which of his sons Cecil Day-Lewis was writing to. At this stage he had two adult sons. One eventually wrote his biography, so he was a writer. He was called Sean, and the second son was Nicholas, who became an engineer. Now, the reason this is interesting is it brings up the theme of acceptance and rejection. And if we can see which son followed in his father's footsteps and which one distanced himself from his father's footsteps, we could imagine that the son he's talking about is the engineer who's moved away from the arts and in that way walking away symbolically from his father. Next, we can look at how the form is influenced by the tone of the poem, and to understand the tone we need to look at the rhyming scheme. So you can see that we have 4 stanzas, each with 3 rhyming lines, and that's quite unsettling. Normally we might expect lines 2 and 4 to rhyme with each other. There would be a sense of completeness to the stanza, but no, Cecil Day-Lewis rejects the idea of completeness because he wants to unsettle us, because the emotions he's experiencing are unsettling. These are the general emotions that his readers will have as parents watching their children grow up and therefore move away from them metaphorically and physically. But it's also a deeply personal relationship with his own son to whom he's writing, who he also feels is moving away from him. And he has to let that son move away in order to prove his love for the son. He ends up with this idea that love is actually letting the person you love go so that they develop their own personality, freedom and life. That's what being a parent is about. So we can see that the tone is unsettling because the parent is pained by this inevitable consequence of loving your child. The next thing we can say about the form is his choice of rhyme. It always ends on a vowel sound, and that gives it a mournful kind of tone. Day, play, away, see, free, be, away, convey, clay, sow, show, go. It feels mournful, doesn't it? And that's deliberate. Okay, we've dealt with form first, and it appears first in the FOSS method because that is your guarantee of top grades. If you can relate the form of the poem to the poet's purpose, boom, you're into grade 7 and above straight away. Now we delve into the opening. The memory we're looking at here is the son's first football match. And presumably this is a special occasion in the father's memory. So we're going to focus on the enjambment here. Since I watched you play. When we get to the end of that line, we don't know it's the first game of football. It sounds as though he hasn't watched his son play since this match. In other words, it gives us the idea that this is not a father who was particularly involved in his son's youth. Now, he does that to question his own relationship with his son and his role as a father. It's something that we all do. That's why he begins by telling his son that he knows almost the exact day this occurred. This is a way of redressing the balance, balancing the scales and saying, look, this is how much I loved you when you were young. I can remember what the sun was like. I can remember almost the exact day. It's burnt into my mind. Next, we're going to focus on the simile, like a satellite wrenched from its orbit. So first, why pick satellite as an image? Well, this poem was published in 1962, which was the height of the beginning of the space race. So it's a modern reference, and this is a modern development that has unsettled him as it's unsettled the world. And so that adds to this idea that he's feeling a sense of loss about how the world has changed generally, and he's making a comparison to how he feels a sense of loss with his relationship with his son. This is dramatized by the idea that the satellite hasn't just descended from its orbit, no, it has been wrenched, a really powerful verb, and that mimics the idea of how he feels wrenched away from his son. Perhaps there's been a dispute between the son and the father. We don't know, but that's the point, because we as readers have to imagine this wrenching moment for ourselves when our sons leave us, or our children leave us. The next verb, drifting, is also chosen very carefully. It suggests that the son shouldn't be drifting away from the father, and that their bond should be stronger, just like a satellite that is wrenched from its orbit, after all, is going to crash. So he's fearful for what's going to happen to his son in the future. Now, my next task in FOSS is to write something about the structure, and the reason for that is structure also appears in the top grade boundary. Now, for structure, I can write about rhyme or repetition or enjambment, any feature that's repeated in the poem. Well, you'll notice I've already written about rhyme and I've already written about enjambment. Well, an obvious element of the structure here is the syllable pattern. So we would expect lines to have the same syllable pattern if it were controlled. Here, the poem kind of averages around 10 syllables per line, but it's irregular, sometimes 9, sometimes 11, sometimes 12. And that again adds to that unsettling feeling we were talking about, which mimics the unsettling feeling of letting your child loose into the world and drift away from you. The other aspect we would expect from a love poem, perhaps, is the iambic pentameter. A sunny day with leaves just turning. That is in perfect iambic pentameter, but other lines don't do that. They stress the first syllable. Sometimes you have two syllables stressed together. For example, quite grasp is two syllables, which you have to stress when you read it. Or in the second stanza, you is a word that you would stress. It doesn't follow the iambic pattern. When we get to the ending, we'll look at the last line, which returns to the iambic pentameter, which kind of suggests that he's resolved his problem in the poem. By the time he gets to the end of the poem, he has come to accept these feelings, and rather than resent them, he accepts that it's a natural part of showing his love to his son. Okay, now I have to write about soap aims. This is just a mnemonic to remind you of language features, and any language features will do, not just the ones here. So simile, onomatopoeia, alliteration, personification, adverbs or assonance, imagery, metaphor, and the senses. You may well have been taught different acronyms. I just needed another S for FOSS. I have a number of options here. Obviously, I don't have to write about them all. One will do. Let's begin with the scatter of boys. This is an invented collective noun. What do you call a group of boys? We'll call them a scatter. It's brilliant because it encompasses the energy of young boys running about. That describes them pretty well. But it also reminds us of that emotion that the father's feeling because it involves a running away, doesn't it? Links to the title and it links to the idea of his son moving away from his father in this moment in his memory, and also moving away from his father now that the son is an adult. We might also focus on the word behind, suggesting that his son has been easily led away by other boys. I would use this again to suggest that this is the son who has become an engineer, somebody archetypally masculine, interested in masculine things, unlike the father who is a poet, and the other son who has become a writer. And it's interesting that Cecil Day-Lewis's two later children, Tamsin and Daniel, became in turn a writer and TV critic for Tamsin and an Oscar-winning actor in the case of Daniel. So you can really see how Nicholas is the odd one out in this family. We could also focus on the son as a half-fledged thing. So fledge refers to feathers and suggests this is a bird-like creature that's not yet got the confidence to fly. This is important because in this metaphor it seems as though the son is about to fly. That's what the freedom implies, but the description half-fledged again suggests disaster. And of course this image of flight refers back to the idea of the satellite. What was the disaster for the satellite? It's going to stop flying because when it's wrenched from orbit, it's going to come crashing to the ground. So we have a sense again that the father feels that his son is not safe. And that's added to by the enjambment here, set free, and then this is contrasted to into a wilderness. The choice of wilderness in this metaphor suggests that the future is dangerous. The son's going to be alone and possibly the victim of whatever else is in that wilderness. If we use the natural imagery here, it suggests there'll be a predator which will be able to damage or kill him. In the next stanza, however, we have a simile which is much more optimistic. The son is now like a winged seed loosened from its parent stem. Now he sees his son going away as something entirely natural and positive, because what happens when the seed leaves? It creates new life. Now he's thinking about his son moving on to start a new family, to become a father himself. If we focus in on the verb loosened, it again suggests that this is beneficial to the son, who has been slightly trapped in the parent relationship before, and now being loosened gives a sense of positive freedom rather than the negative freedom we had in the previous stanza. Now I'm going to link that to these two amazing metaphors which finish the stanza. So first we have the small, the scorching ordeals. Now on the one hand, scorching suggests how painful this ordeal is of losing his son, but then the alliterative and contrasting small suggests that he knows his emotions are much bigger than the occasion demands. He knows that his son going away feels painful now, but in the future will just be seen as part of the natural process and won't be as painful at all. He'll learn to live with it. And then we have this religious imagery here, which fire one's irresolute clay. This is a biblical reference. So the idea that we're made from earth comes in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis. That's part of the creation story. But the specific reference to clay happens elsewhere in the Bible. And I think the one that's most relevant is Isaiah here. But now, O Lord, thou art our Father. We are the clay, and thou our potter. We are all the work of thy hand. So we can see this really clearly here. Why would clay be fired? Well, it gets fired in a kiln to be put into a new shape. And it's this idea of life as a potter and God as a potter which Day-Lewis is using here. The son is irresolute clay. In other words, clay that hasn't been formed into a shape yet, but once it gets fired in the kiln, then it forms its shape. In other words, he's imagining his son now going to find his own shape, becoming the person who he's going to be by breaking symbolically this tie to the father and the home. And then we have this irony that although the fire is terribly painful and it's scorching, it actually leads to something really, really positive and transformational, the son taking his destined shape, if you like, or the shape he has chosen himself. In this metaphor, the son hasn't chosen his own form, he's been crafted by the potter, who in this instance is God. Now this links usefully with a piece of context, which is that Cecil Day-Lewis's father was a rector, a vicar. And so we can see that it's very likely in this poem he sees the relationship with his son as part of God's plan, not just nature's plan. Okay, now I have to write about the ending for two reasons. The ending is always where things are resolved, where the writer introduces a new way of looking at things, and that works for every poem and indeed every text you ever read. And then there is the rather obvious reason that when you deal with the ending, you show the examiner you've understood the complete text, and that gives you the detail necessary to get full marks. Well, you can write about anything in the ending. I'm going to give you a range of choices. Let's begin by looking at the tentative language. We've already mentioned the return of iambic pentameter in the final line, which gives us this sense of acceptance in the letting go of his son. But if we go back earlier, we can see perhaps and could, which introduces this acceptance. And so that gives us the idea that he's not fully certain that he should accept what's happening. There is still resistance. So we're left with this moment of tension where we don't know in the future, a day, a week, a year, which way the father is actually going to feel. Will the pain diminish or will it remain the same? Next, we're going to focus on to another metaphor, but none that so gnaws at my mind still. So here we are, 18 years after he was watching his son playing, and he still has this thing that's gnawing at his mind. Now it's worth asking why this parting has upset him so much. A logical argument will be that he's felt guilt all the way through his son's childhood, that he hasn't paid him enough attention. That returns us to that enjambment at the beginning on the word play. It seems when we get to the end of the poem that he realises that he has not been a supportive enough parent for his son, and that of course partly explains why there's the distance in the relationship now. It's caused by how the father behaved when he had so much influence on his young son. I think that's also backed up by this introduction to the stanza. I have had worse partings. So you would expect those to gnaw on his mind more, which means that the effect of that parting when the boy went off to school is actually greater than the worse partings that seemed terrible at the time. Now, if we dip in autobiographically here, we'll see that many of those partings seem to be the affairs that C. Day-Lewis had. It's possibly no coincidence that Nicholas wrote extensively about his father's affairs when he wrote the biography. These were so distressing, in fact, that Daniel Day-Lewis tried to commit suicide at the age of 16 and has not spoken to his brother since the publication of the biography. You will notice there is no mother in this poem, she's absent. So the divorce was clearly his own fault, and we could use this to suggest an element of guilt in the way that the upbringing he's given his son has caused the distance between them. We could zoom in on the adverb roughly, which here is talking about roughly right, nearly accurate, but obviously we associate with roughness, with violence. And so this adverb is chosen to remind the son of how roughly treated the father feels by the son's parting, but also an acknowledgement that the father's own behaviour must have felt rough to the son. hence the feelings of guilt that now gnaw at his mind. Now we must analyse the final couplet, and we really have to decide how far this resolution feels hopeful. So in this line, how selfhood begins, we can see that he's now looking at his son, being able to become himself. That's what selfhood means. And the walking away isn't just leaving his father, it's walking towards his new selfhood. So that's positive. And then the father being able to let go of his son is a proof of love. And then a little more controversially, this works both ways. He's imagining that his son is letting go of him, and that the way the son lets go of him also proves the love for the father. Now that, of course, is an interpretation that's much more difficult for the father to accept. In your conclusion, you want to talk about this tension between acceptance and rejection, guilt at how he's created this relationship with his son, and optimism that this relationship is all part of God's plan. And more generally, when talking to parents about their own children, just part of nature's cycle, where we love our children and yet they inevitably grow up and leave us. Not in my case, unfortunately. My 24-year-old son is still living with us. But that's lockdown for you. It is 18 years ago. Almost to the day, a sunny day with leaves just turning, the touchlines new ruled, since I watched you play your first game of football. Then, like a satellite, wrenched from its orbit, go drifting away, behind a scatter of boys. I can see you walking away from me towards the school with the pathos of a half-fledged thing set free into a wilderness, the gate of one who finds no path where the path should be. That hesitant figure eddying away like a winged seed loosened from its parent stem has something I never quite grasped to convey about nature's give and take, the small, the scorching ordeals which fire one's irresolute clay. I have had worse partings, but none that so gnaws at my mind still. Perhaps it is roughly saying what God alone could perfectly show. How selfhood begins with a walking away, and love is proved in the letting go. Now I have given you much more than you would ever need to use in the exam. You would only need one thing from each of these sections, because after all you're going to compare this poem to another poem where you'll talk about those sections of that poem as well. So go back over the video and make one detailed note for each of the form, the opening, the structure, a language feature and the ending, always relating it to the poet's purpose. And I promise you, you will smash the top grades. Now, if you want to see this method applied to another poem, click on the video appearing here. Thank you very much. See you soon on my channel.